So Spaceballs is a thing. It's also just fun to say. Spaceballs. You can tell why this kind of movie would appeal to my crude and childish sense of humor. Spaceballs was the first Mel Brooks movie that I watched. Having seen the original Star Wars trilogy, my brother said we should check out Spaceballs, and I found it gut-bustingly funny. And not just because of the scatological humor, although that was definitely part of it, but also because of the absurdly over-the-top slapstick comedy, the referential humor that roasts Star Wars, and the self-deprecating humor of both Mel Brooks the man and how he makes films, which is a reoccurring theme in almost all of his movies. After Spaceballs, I was introduced to The Producers, which I saw live on stage. This opened up my eyes to another aspect of Mel Brooks in his musicality. With only 2 of his movies under my belt, or a movie and a play as it were, Brooks had managed to tap into something that I really enjoyed. But these 2 movies weren't just flukes, but part of a whole roster of hilarious comedies that people still talk about, laugh at, and watch, and not just as comedic musings, but as serious works of cinema. With every movie, play, or song, Brooks solidified himself as a comedic genius and thoughtful director. But hey!
When you go teet, flaunt teet.
It was after Gene Wilder passed away that I discovered that Wilder wasn't just famous for playing Willy Wonka, but was also famous for a lot of the work he did alongside Mel Brooks as a co-writer and actor. So in honoring Gene Wilder's passing by watching his movies, I found myself watching a lot of Mel Brooks works, and wound up familiarizing myself with all of his movies. This is the point when you, the viewer, go, wait a second, the Janglez hasn't mentioned Spaceballs once since like the first 30 seconds of the video, but don't worry, I'm getting back to that. It was during the time of familiarizing myself with all of Brooks' works that I came across the movie High Anxiety. It's not Brooks' most popular film and not even close to his funniest, but I was struck at how clever this movie was and how it carefully referenced every aspect of Alfred Hitchcock's infamously meticulous directorial style. From here, I began to re-examine Brooks' opus and discovered another layer to the parodies that I hadn't noticed before. And what did I find?
We ain't found shit!
That's actually not true, I found quite a bit. Such as the way Brooks approaches parody, the difference between parody and pastiche, the way his movies reveal how films are made, and the reason parody isn't as popular right now. These factors all work to great effect in all of Brooks' films, but Spaceballs is arguably the most popular, so I'm going to use it as the example. And so today, I want to talk about Spaceballs. Spaceballs. Spaceballs was shot mostly on sound stages, with the same approach that Brooks used on all of his films. There was always a plan, but there was a heavy emphasis on allowing actors to improvise, with encouragement from Brooks to go off script. It was even reported that if Brooks thought something was funnier, then he would abandon the script altogether. That isn't to say that Brooks didn't have a vision. He always had a clear goal, but the comedy was there to serve the movie's story or point. For this movie, Brooks does act, but unlike some of his other features, he relegates himself to smaller roles in favor of some really big names from the comedy scene at the time. So even though Brooks reportedly approached and was turned down by some bigger named actors, it didn't really matter because he had the venerable John Candy, rest in peace, and the incomparable Rick Moranis, rest in peace to his acting career. Interestingly, when this movie came out, it was not any kind of hit. Although not really maligned, it was mostly viewed as an unfunny generic film with a crude sense of humor and a poor attempt at a sci-fi parody. Nothing like the beloved Young Frankenstein from a decade earlier. It wasn't until the movie came out on home video and television that it was praised for its clever jabs at Star Wars and its highly quotable one-liners.
How many assholes we got on this ship anyhow?
Yo!
Spoiler warning, but really, if you've seen Star Wars, you're in the clear. Just be warned that you're missing out on the hilarity. The story begins with President Scroob, who is the leader of planet Spaceballs, a group of people who have squandered and polluted their own air supply. He orders his enforcers, Colonel Sanders and Lord Helmet, to kidnap the princess of the planet Druidia in order to levy her for the code to Druidia's planet-wide shield, which protects the planet's fresh air supply. But Princess Vespa is already unhappy with her arranged marriage to Prince Valium, so instead of going through with the marriage, she escapes with her maid of honor in tow. Literally. Her father, the king, tempts 2 bounty hunters, Lone Star and Barf, with a large reward if they can bring her back before she finds herself in danger. The pair manage to save Vespa and her companion before they are captured by the Spaceballs, but they are only able to avoid trouble thanks to Lord Helmet's incompetence with lightspeed travel.
No, lightspeed is too slow.
Lightspeed too slow?
Yes, we're gonna have to go right to ludicrous speed.
Now out of fuel, Lone Star is forced to land on a desert planet, where the heroes are met with a bunch of aliens who take them to the cave of the sage Yogurt, who, before teaching Lone Star about the magic of the Schwartz, tells the crew about his plans for merchandising the film. Lord Helmet locates the escapees and manages to capture Vespa. He threatens to reverse her nose job if she doesn't give up the code to the shield. Of course, her father gives up the codes in favor of keeping her nose. Now, with the use of a giant transforming spaceship called the Mega Maid, the Spaceballs begin sucking up the air from Druidia. But then Lone Star uses the power of the Schwartz to reverse this. Lone Star then boards the Mega Maid and defeats Lord Helmet, who accidentally presses the self-destruct button. Lone Star takes only enough reward money to cover his costs rather than what he was promised, and then he leaves. Despite his and Vespa's feelings for each other, she can only marry another prince. But Yogurt sends Lone Star a message revealing that he is in fact a prince, so he returns and is now able to marry Vespa. Like all of Mel Brooks' films, this is very clearly a parody, and in this case is making fun of Star Wars. All of the characters are easily identifiable stand-ins for their Star Wars counterparts. The set pieces, locations, and general events are pretty thinly veiled. Actually, as far as Brooks' parodies go, this one is pretty on the nose about everything, with only a few references to other science fiction movies. Brooks' other works, such as Blazing Saddles, were less parody of one franchise and usually a parody of a whole genre. High Anxiety and Young Frankenstein poke fun at very specific narratives in pop culture, with all of Hitchcock's work in the former and the classic Frankenstein movies from the 1930s, as well as a few other horror movies from that era in the latter. And Blazing Saddles is of course making fun of westerns. Although Brooks was first and foremost a comedian, as he transitioned into spending more time directing, it became clear that he had a gift for pointing out and jabbing at the way films were told and how audiences interacted with them. What is most fascinating about this is that Brooks was never cynical about his parodies. As a filmmaker, he had picked up something that a lot of great directors suffer from, and that's being an unapologetic film nerd. I honestly think this is part of what made Brooks' films so timeless and so fun to watch. You can always tell there's a great respect for the movies that are being spoofed. In the beginning of High Anxiety, there's even a dedication to Hitchcock and his method of filmmaking. Everything in that movie, from the set dressing and costumes to the dialogue to even the music, is all meticulously curated, because that's how Hitchcock was as a filmmaker.
What a dramatic airport!
He was famous for being detail-oriented, and so Brooks and his cast and crew knew they had to approach High Anxiety in the same way in order for the parody to land. For Spaceballs, Brooks asked for permission from George Lucas to make the film, and even had a lot of crew from Star Wars work on Spaceballs in post-production. This gave the film the same look as Star Wars, but also speaks to the great respect that Brooks had for the films that he was making fun of. And he was making fun of them, but he was also praising them at the same time, and drawing attention to why we enjoy movies when they can be so silly. And you know, he did it with a penis joke or two thrown in for good measure.
And I see your Schwartz is as big as mine.
High Anxiety, like Spaceballs, is an homage, and they're both love letters to the works that they are based on, and that puts them in a strange position when it comes to parodies. And this is because of what a parody is, and how it is so similar, but still distinct from the pastiche. Pastiche and parodies are often compared and contrasted because they do have a lot in common. They are both the act of borrowing from other genres or works in the attempt to create something new. The biggest difference being in tone. Pastiche is often described as the use of aspects from a genre or piece of work or works in the attempt to draw attention to them and praise them for what they are. Whereas parody is the borrowing of one or more aspects of a work or works with the goal of making fun of them. So it's clear that these concepts are almost two sides of the same coin, and they both have pros and cons. So how is it that Mel Brooks can create films that are parodies of works of art, and he can be both respectful and full of praise while still criticizing and undermining them at the same time? His positivity is indicative of the pastiche, and yet no one would suggest that Spaceballs is not a parody. Traditionally, parody was understood to be the use of double voice. This is the use of words or ideas from another piece of work that regurgitates them in a mocking way. Think of the way that somebody might repeat what you just said back to you, but in a whiny voice in order to mock you. The meaning of the words are undercut by this tone as a way of ridiculing and reducing the person. Parody traditionally can be thought of as the same thing, but with art instead of people, or younger siblings. However, there is another interpretation of parody that comes from everyone's favorite Russian formalist, Mikhail Bakhtin.
What do you mean you don't have a favorite Russian formalist?
Bakhtin suggests that parody is more about the laughter that comes from hyperbolizing the language, tropes, and tone of the art in question. Parody functions based on the way it can be read in terms of its multiplicities. Instead of the doubling voice being mocking, Bakhtin suggests that the comedy comes from the understanding that the parody is mocking the original, but from a place of understanding the original. This can still be mocking, but that the parody now becomes multifaceted. Instead of just the two meanings of the double voice, Bakhtin posited the idea of the heteroglossia, or the variety of ways language can be used, read, understood, and affect the experiences that one has with the written word. For parody, this means that although Spaceballs is clearly making fun of Star Wars through its overemphasis and exaggeration, it can also simultaneously exist as a celebration of the original trilogy, or a Ridge-Tridge for short. Taking this celebration further, Mel Brooks often draws attention to the act of filming within the stories and parodies that he's creating. I already mentioned how the look of High Anxiety was crucially important by exaggerating Hitchcock's style, but Brooks even draws attention to the act of filmmaking by involving the camera in on the comedy. In Spaceballs, there is a dramatic shot where the camera dollies in on Lord Helmet as he gives his proclamation. Colonel Sanders is forced to get out of the way as the camera draws closer, and eventually the camera is so close it collides with Lord Helmet's helmet. This draws attention to the way dramatic moments are shot and how the camera is often forgotten about, but a critical point of how these scenes play out. At another point in the movie, Barf calls out the editing from one scene to another as it dissolves.
Nice dissolve.
This is making fun of editing as a part of the language of film. The movie even does this narratively by having Lord Helmet address the audience directly after the thesis of their evil plan is spoken out loud, just to comedically underline the already heavy-handed exposition.
Thereby destroying planet Druidia and saving planet Spaceball. Everybody got that? Good!
For another example, look at this scene where Colonel Sanders and Lord Helmet find the rebels' location by watching the movie they are in the middle of making because somebody already has it on VHS. Besides being a trippy fourth wall break, it's also the same kind of indictment on merchandising that Yogurt will talk about later on in the movie.
Colonel Sanders, may I speak with you, please?
Yes, sir.
How can there be a cassette of Spaceballs the movie? We're still in the middle of making it.
It also may help explain why the movie was so popular on home video. Drawing attention to the act of filmmaking is risky, but it works because the way films are shot is part of the parody and gets laughs, but it's also part of the praise of the original, especially in High Anxiety, where drawing attention to the kinds of shots Hitchcock would set up is part of the joke of that movie. This positive parody is hugely important to all of Brooks' films, and it's one of the biggest reasons why I think parody has basically died out in recent years outside of small contained parodies in episodes of TV shows. Most of the parodies that have come out in the last 2 decades don't have the same kind of respect for the art of filmmaking that Brooks has. Instead, they're only mocking and cynical versions of the films that they're trying to make fun of. Earlier I mentioned the term pastiche, and there are several meanings behind this concept, with the postmodern pastiche being one where authors borrow tropes and tones from other genres in order to enhance their artworks. Like the way Roger Rabbit is a noir, but also a cartoon comedy. It's a great example of a postmodern pastiche, and you can check out a whole episode I did on that too. But another kind of pastiche is the empty or hollow pastiche. This is when works or genres are borrowed from simply because they are recognizable, and there's no praise or comedy in the replication. Although I do not think that there is such a thing as bad art, I do think that empty pastiche masquerading as parody in an attempt to be funny is heartbreaking. It winds up feeling cynical because there's no love for the original. No matter how contrived the original may have been, simply pointing your finger and laughing at a thing isn't the same as a careful understanding and then exaggeration in order to examine the original's meaning or the way people enjoy it. Instead, it just winds up feeling kind of mean. And that is exactly what Brooks wasn't. His movies were funny and mocking, but they were never cynical and never mean. He would pull the curtain back on how films were made and what plot conceits or suspension of disbelief that audiences would willingly go through in order to be complicit in the enjoyment of a movie and the act of filmmaking, but they were always with the utmost respect for the original. They were filled with comedy and laughter and a love of film and filmmaking. All of Brooks' films were also generally original stories that still worked as their own movies with believable, if cliché or hyperbolic characters that had real wants and needs. Watching Spaceballs doesn't make me dislike Star Wars, it makes me laugh at how silly Star Wars is when I enjoy that series. It makes me enjoy Star Wars more, which is kinda hard to do when Disney seems to make cynical parodies of Star Wars without even trying. Well, did I just say that out loud? Whether Spaceballs is your kind of humor or not, there's sure to be something in Brooks' catalog of masterpiece after masterpiece that will tickle your funny bone, and hopefully make you think about how genre and art deconstruction can serve to spoof and jab at art, but also elevate it with a genuine and hilarious love of movies, and the creative teams that work on them. And that is why I think Mel Brooks is the master of parody, and why Spaceballs might be crude, but it's definitely genius. But also Blazing Saddles, and High Anxiety, and Robin Hood Men in Tights, and the producers, both the movie and the musical movie, and Young Frankenstein, and the silent movie, and Life Stinks, and Dracula Dead and Loving It. Here are my stray thoughts. Although I use Spaceballs as an example, High Anxiety really works as an homage to Hitchcock's filmmaking and is probably the most underrated of Brooks' work. But Young Frankenstein is my favorite in terms of the amount of laughs I get out of it. I think it's interesting to see how well Brooks knows Star Wars because the Planet Shield thing was his own creation for the movie, except Disney basically stole it for Rogue One. Yeah, right? Look how similar that is when you examine it. That actually happened. May the Schwartz be with you! Thanks so much for watching that video. Remember to hit that like button like you're sucking up all the oxygen from the atmosphere, and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode of This Is a Thing or our weekly podcast. It was really awesome that I got a chance to go back and watch all of Mel Brooks' films, so let me know what your favorite is. Don't forget that all of next month is Soup-tember, so stick around for all superhero-related content right here on the channel. Unless you're watching this in the future, in which case, go back and watch all of the episodes from Soup-tember that you missed. All that and more is happening right here on Cinemasters' Ultimate Timeline.